I saw him just past midnight, limping, soaked, and wild-eyed, just outside the broken gates of the old train depot. At first, I thought it was a hallucination. You don't expect to see a lion walking alone through the flooded streets of a city. Not here. Not ever. But there he was, ribs showing through his muddy coat, tail dragging behind him, and his massive paws sloshing through ankle-deep water like he didn't care where he stepped anymore. He wasn't roaring. He wasn't growling. He was just moving, like a ghost that hadn't yet realized it was lost. He stopped near a row of overturned garbage bins, sniffed the air, and looked straight at me. For one long second, we just stared at each other across the road. His eyes weren't fierce. They were scared. Not the kind of fear you'd expect from a cornered predator, but the broken, hollow kind you see in someone who's already given up. He didn't bolt or charge. He simply turned his head slowly, as if he expected to be hurt, and walked toward the shadows. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. My phone slipped from my hand into the water, but I didn't care. I wasn't reaching for help. I was frozen by helplessness. The flood had hit fast. 3 days of unrelenting rain turned our quiet town into a wet labyrinth of submerged cars, collapsed fences, and blackouts. People were gone. Businesses closed. The zoo, 2 miles east, was nothing more than a rumor at that point. Someone had said the gates failed. Animals escaped, but no one knew for sure. That lion confirmed everything. Somehow, in the chaos, he'd been left behind or swept free. And now he was wandering, hunted by fear and hunger in a city that didn't know how to receive him. I ran back inside, soaked to the bone, grabbed an old raincoat, and then returned to the front steps. He was gone. The street was empty, but the feeling lingered. Something wild and out of place had passed through, something fragile wearing the face of a beast, and I couldn't just forget that. I couldn't unsee his limping gait or the way his sides heaved like he hadn't rested in days. I couldn't ignore how he looked at me, not as prey, but almost like he was asking for something. Anything. Help, maybe. Or just a place to be still. The next morning, I couldn't eat, couldn't scroll my phone. I kept replaying that moment again and again. Eventually, I got into my truck, packed a few blankets, water jugs, and protein bars, and drove toward the abandoned quarter. I wasn't a vet. I wasn't a rescuer. I didn't even know what I would do if I saw him again. But I had to try. You don't walk away from something like that. You don't forget a creature that looks you in the eye and silently pleads for its life. I didn't find him that day, but I did find claw marks in the mud behind a burnt-out deli, large ones, and a broken metal grate pried open near the storm drain. He was out there, hiding, surviving, waiting, maybe. I made it my mission then. Quietly, without telling anyone, I would find that lion again. I didn't know how or when, but I would. I went back the next morning, then again the next evening. Every time I brought food, but not meat, just things I thought a starving animal might sniff at from a distance. Boiled eggs, soft bread. I left them near dry spots under ledges and rusted stairwells, places I figured he might crawl into for shelter. Sometimes the food was gone. Sometimes it wasn't. But what haunted me most were the prints. Giant paw marks, pressed deep into the muddy corners of alleyways, always dragging slightly on the left. His limp was worsening. On the third day, I followed a fresh trail through a shattered fence behind a warehouse. It wasn't just paw prints anymore. I found blood. Just a few streaks on the concrete near a dumpster. It hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't fear. It was grief. The kind you feel when you know something is suffering out there and you're just steps behind, always too late. I knelt beside the stain and touched it, almost without realizing. It was dry already. Whatever had happened had passed. But he was still out there, bleeding, alone. I called every shelter in the district that afternoon. Most didn't believe me. "A lion?" they said, laughing or hesitating. "You sure it wasn't a dog?" One woman asked if I had photos. I didn't. He always disappeared before I could lift my phone. I didn't blame her. I wouldn't have believed it either, but one call did give me hope. An old animal handler from the zoo, a man named Marco, called me back personally. "You really saw him?" he asked, his voice low and shaky. "We had a lion go missing after the flood. Male. Name's Django. He's not aggressive, just scared." Hearing his name changed everything. Django. He wasn't just a lion anymore. He was someone. A being with a history, with routines, with handlers who once whispered his name when feeding him or calming him. That small detail pierced right through me. Django wasn't lost in the wild by accident. He had been raised in care, then abandoned by disaster. He wasn't meant to survive like this. Marco offered to meet me the next morning, said he'd bring a tranq gun, just in case, and a transport crate borrowed from a friend's mobile vet unit. We agreed to keep it quiet. "Too many people think rescue means chasing with phones and flashlights," he muttered. "We spook him, he runs. We can't let that happen." I agreed. This wasn't a spectacle. This was a life hanging by a thread. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window for hours, replaying the way Django had looked at me in the street. His ribs, his eyes, the blood. What if we were too late? What if he never let us near? Again. Somewhere out there, Django was limping through debris and broken glass, hiding in dark corners, waiting for help he didn't understand. At dawn, I loaded my truck again. But this time, I wasn't just searching. I was part of something bigger. A promise had been made. And this time, I wouldn't leave without him. Marco arrived in a white van just past 7 a.m. He looked older than I expected. Gray around the edges, hands calloused like someone who'd spent his life earning every lesson. In the back of his van was a large steel transport cage padded with straw, and beside it, a long case that held the tranquilizer rifle. "Haven't used this thing in years," he said quietly, locking the bolt into place. "But if he's hurt, we won't get close otherwise. One shot. That's all we'll need if we do it right." We started with the warehouse district. The Tihi prints I'd found earlier had been washed over by another night of light rain, but Marco knew where to look. Along the building's sun-warmed sides, under metal stairs, behind trash piles where food scent lingered. "Lions don't move like dogs," he murmured. "They move like ghosts when they're scared." His voice had a strange reverence in it, like he wasn't just talking about an animal, but an old friend. Hours passed with no sign. The city was waking back up now. Some streets were being drained, shop owners returning to assess damage. But this part of town was still forgotten, the kind of place where wild things might linger if they had nowhere else to go. Around noon, we stopped near an abandoned car dealership, the lot choked with weeds and scattered debris. That's when we found it. Scattered chicken bones, fresh droppings, and a large indentation in the tall grass beside a broken sign. Marco crouched and touched the ground. "He was here," he whispered. "Last night. Maybe even this morning." I moved slowly toward the back of the lot where the building had partially collapsed. There was a hollow, jagged opening where the service bay used to be. Inside, it was pitch black. I took one step forward and heard it. Not a growl. Not a roar, just a low, strained breath. It echoed faintly from the dark, ragged, unsteady. My spine locked in place. Marco motioned for me to step back. He didn't raise the rifle yet, just listened. Then he reached into the van and pulled out a raw meat pack wrapped in plastic. He slid it slowly toward the opening and backed off, whispering, "Let's give him a reason to come to us." Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then, a shadow moved. At first, it was just a shuffle, barely noticeable. But then a massive paw emerged, followed by the bowed head and thin shoulders of a lion who no longer looked like a king, but like a survivor. Django's eyes scanned us, sunken and half-glazed as if the world was just too bright, too loud. His fur was caked in grime, a wound visible along his right thigh. But he didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He collapsed. Not in panic, in surrender, like his body simply couldn't carry him one more step. Marco stepped forward with the rifle, but paused. "No need," he said, breath-catching. He's giving himself up. I didn't know it was possible for a lion to break your heart. But watching Django lower his head onto the pavement, eyes closing as if finally allowed to rest, did something to me I still can't explain. We moved quickly. The crate was rolled up. Marco checked for pulse, breath, signs of infection. Django didn't resist. He barely stirred as the crate door shut behind him, and for the first time in days, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. We had him. Now came the harder part, bringing him back to life. The crate door clicked shut, and for a moment all we could hear was Django's slow, heavy breathing, like wind dragging through dry grass. Marco knelt beside the cage, one hand on the metal bars, not saying anything, just listening. I could tell this wasn't just another animal to him. Maybe it never had been. "He remembers me," Marco finally said, voice cracking. "He used to lean his whole weight into the fence when I'd scratch behind his ear. That was years ago. Before the flood. Before the world forgot about him. We didn't waste time." I helped Marco load the crate into the van. It took everything we had to lift and balance it carefully. Django's body wasn't just big, it was limp, dead weight, like his soul had taken a step out and hadn't returned yet. His tail twitched once as the van door shut. I kept my eyes on him through the narrow crate window, praying silently he'd hang on just a little longer. Marco didn't speak much during the drive. His hands stayed locked on the wheel, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. "We've got a shelter south of here," he said quietly. "Not fancy, not funded, but it's got space and quiet. He needs quiet more than anything." I asked what would happen next. He shrugged. "First, food, then fluids. Then, we see. Sometimes they don't come back. Not all of them do." The van bumped through damaged roads and muddy detours for nearly an hour. Django didn't make a sound. I watched the rise and fall of his chest, slow and deliberate. I wondered what images might have haunted him. Crowds screaming, fences breaking, floodwaters rising. Had he heard the other animals cry? Had he seen people run from him, not toward him? I'd never realized how deeply loneliness could cut even the fiercest creatures. We arrived at a clearing shielded by trees and chain-link fencing. A makeshift sign hung crookedly at the gate. "Second Home Wildlife Shelter. Quiet lives begin. Again." It wasn't beautiful, but it felt safe. Safe enough. A team of 2 volunteers met us at the back entrance, blankets in hand, eyes wide at the sight of Django. One woman, Ellie, covered her mouth when she saw him. He was on the registry. We thought he was gone. Her voice cracked like she'd found a missing child. They helped guide the crate into a shaded pen, already prepped with hay and a soft corner mat. We didn't open the door right away. Marco sat beside the crate and talked to him. Not loudly, not commandingly, just softly, like you would to someone waking from a bad dream. "Django, you're safe now. You're not alone." He didn't move, didn't even lift his head, but I saw one ear twitch at Marco's voice, and somehow, that tiny flicker gave all of us hope. Later that evening, I sat alone by the chain-link fence, watching the shadows stretch across the shelter yard. The other animals, rescued foxes, a 3-legged wolf dog, even an old cheetah, were quiet, like they knew something sacred had arrived. Django lay still in his crate, wrapped in the kind of stillness that wasn't quite sleep. It was survival, in pause, and I thought, maybe that's the first step for healing, knowing you've finally stopped running. The first time Django ate, it was barely a mouthful. A few soft chunks of boiled meat, hand-prepared by the volunteers and placed gently, just inside the crate. He didn't pounce or snarl. He sniffed them cautiously, pawed one piece, and slowly took it into his mouth like a creature that had forgotten what trust, even in food, felt like. We all watched from a distance, barely breathing. It wasn't just a meal. It was a signal. He was still choosing life. Marco stayed with him through the night, sleeping on a folding chair outside the enclosure, wrapped in an old jacket. I offered to stay too, but he shook his head. He knows my scent. It'll calm him more than you realize. In the morning, Django had shifted slightly out of the crate. Not fully, just one paw stretched beyond the bars, resting in the hay, a quiet gesture of curiosity or peace. The shelter operated on donations and heart. That much was clear. The fences were held up by makeshift poles. The signage was hand-painted. But the energy? It was pure warmth. No flash, no pity. Just people who showed up day after day because they couldn't not care. And now they had a lion to care for. One who didn't roar, didn't bite, didn't even lift his head much, but one who was alive. And that was enough. Over the next few days, Django began to stir more. He'd step halfway out of the crate when no one was looking, then retreat the moment footsteps approached. He drank slowly from a large metal bowl, eyes darting, muscles tense. But he stayed. He didn't bolt, didn't pace or claw at the walls. He simply stayed. That was a victory in itself. Marco adjusted his wound dressing every afternoon. The gash on Django's thigh was deep but healing. No infection, no fever. "He's tough," Marco muttered one day as he gently cleaned the area. "But there's a kind of sadness in him, deeper than anything I've seen in a wild animal." I knew what he meant. Django didn't act like a lion who'd been rescued. He acted like one who'd been left behind, like he hadn't quite accepted this wasn't just another temporary place he'd be forgotten in. I started bringing my old guitar to the shelter, sitting outside his enclosure and playing softly, not to entertain him, just to be. Sometimes I'd see his ears shift toward the sound. Sometimes he ignored it completely. But something about those quiet sessions made the air feel lighter, like we were all breathing together again. By the end of the week, Django walked a full lap around the pen before settling down in the shaded corner near the tree stump. Ellie cried when she saw it. "He's starting to explore," she whispered, like we'd just watched a child take his first step. I nodded, but inside I felt something even deeper, the beginnings of belief. Django was coming back, not as the lion he once was, but as the one who survived. And that version of him, that one deserved the world. It was 2 weeks before Django truly looked at me again. Not a glance, not a flinch, but a real, full, focused look, like he was seeing me, not just scanning for threats or movement. I had just set down a bucket of fresh water when he stood up from the shaded corner of his enclosure and walked, calmly, deliberately, to the fence line. Not pacing, not aggressive, just curious. I froze. My hands stayed low and my breathing slowed as I dropped to a knee, matching his eye level. His eyes were still tired, amber and heavy, but something had changed. The haze was lifting. That hollow emptiness that once swallowed his gaze had begun to clear. What stared back at me now was something ancient, still, and watching. I spoke, softly, barely above a whisper. "You remember me, don't you?" He blinked once, then twice, and then, like a gesture too subtle to mean anything unless you were desperate for hope, his tail swept the ground behind him. One slow drag across. The straw. Marco saw it too. He stood beside me at the fence, silent, but I heard his breath hitch. "That's trust," he murmured. "Not a lot, but enough to say, 'I see you. I don't fear you.'" He didn't reach out. Neither did I. We didn't need to. That moment was sacred, and we knew better than to rush it. After that day, Django changed in small ways. He started choosing spots near the fence when resting, not the hidden corners. He no longer jolted at sudden sounds. And when I played my guitar, softer now, slower, he'd lift his head and stay watching. I never played anything fancy. Just slow progressions, chords that felt like warm blankets after cold nights. The volunteers started calling him the King in the Shade. Not because he looked regal, he was still recovering, thin, fur patchy in places, but because there was something undeniable about him. Even in stillness, Django carried gravity. His silence was never emptiness. It was presence. He had survived. something none of us could fully understand, and every step he took now felt like defiance against that darkness. One evening, I sat with Ellie and Marco by the fence long after the sun dipped below the trees. We shared tea in silence, watching Django lie beneath his favorite tree, head lifted toward the sky. Ellie said something that stuck with me. It's not just that he survived, it's that he's teaching us how to. She was right. Every careful step Django took, every glance, every moment he didn't run. It was a lesson in patience, in stillness, in earning trust inch by inch. He was showing us what recovery looked like when there were no shortcuts, no quick fixes, just time, space, and kindness. And in some way, I think we were all healing alongside him. The first time Django roared, it wasn't loud, it wasn't even particularly long, but it stopped every living thing in the shelter, as if the trees themselves had leaned in to listen. It was early, just after dawn, and I had arrived before the others. The fog still hung low, curling around the fence lines and between the trees like steam rising from the earth. I just set down my thermos when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that climbed, caught, and pushed itself into a short, fractured roar. I turned and saw him standing near the center of the pen, his head high, chest lifted, and breath misting into the cool morning air. He looked thinner than any lion on a wildlife documentary. His fur still hadn't fully grown back around his ribs. But none of that mattered. He had found his voice again. I didn't cheer, didn't clap or call for Marco. I just watched, quietly, hand pressed to my chest as if my body needed help holding itself together. That sound, raw, imperfect but undeniably powerful, felt like the very proof that Django was still fighting. Not just surviving, living. When Marco arrived an hour later, I told him what happened. He didn't speak at first, just walked to the enclosure, eyes locked on Django, who was lying calmly near the stump now, licking his paw as if the morning hadn't started with something earth-shaking. Marco crouched by the fence. He was always quiet, he said, even at the zoo. The other lions made noise. He was different. Didn't waste energy on power displays, only roared when he had something to say. I nodded. Then he just said, "I'm still here." The next few days brought more subtle shifts. Django started approaching the fence during feeding instead of waiting for us to leave. He began responding to familiar voices. Mine, Marco's, Ellie's, with ear twitches, slight head tilts, even the occasional soft chuff. It wasn't affection. Not yet, but it was presence. Attention. Proof that he no longer saw us as threats, but maybe companions. One afternoon, as I sat sketching near his enclosure, he stood up and walked directly toward me. There was no food in my hand, no guitar, no sound at all. Just a quiet moment under the wide sky. He stopped right at the fence, lowered his head, and stared. And then he did something that undid me entirely. He leaned in, slow and deliberate, and pressed the side of his massive head gently against the wire. It only lasted a few seconds, but it was more than I could bear. I blinked back tears and whispered, "Hey, Django, I see you." He stepped back, turned once, and padded off into the shade again. Later, Marco told me, that's how they show trust, body weight. If he leans into you, he's giving you his calm. That's not dominance, that's peace. Django was becoming himself again. Not the lion from before, but something new, shaped by pain, survival, and the steady drum of kindness. And in that version of him, there was power. Not in his teeth or roar, but in his ability to trust again. News had started to spread. Quietly, respectfully, but word of a lion rescued from the flood, one who had wandered the streets like a ghost and found safety in a forgotten shelter, had begun circulating among local wildlife circles. Some wrote in to donate, others sent. Supplies, bedding, food, medical items, but one letter stood out. It was handwritten, ink slightly smudged, signed simply, "To Django, from someone who remembers." Inside was a photo, grainy, faded, but unmistakable. It showed a younger Django sitting upright in a sun-dappled enclosure, leaning into the hand of a little girl who stood on the opposite side of the fence. Her tiny fingers pressed through the wire. I visited him every week for 2 years, the note read. He used to wait for me. I called him my quiet lion. I never forgot him after we moved. I'm glad he's still alive. If he remembers me, tell him I grew up. It broke something in me. Marco read it twice before whispering, "Let's invite her." And we did. Her name was Ava now. She was 22, studying wildlife conservation at a nearby university. When she arrived the next weekend, Django had just been let into the larger section of the shelter yard. His first time. Outside his recovery pen. He moved with slow grace, his limp still present but less pronounced. He had grown fuller. His coat had started to thicken. He looked at last like a lion reclaiming his body. Ava stood at the fence with both hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't try to call out, didn't wave, just waited, eyes wide, breathing shallow, and then, as if drawn by memory, Django turned. He stared at her for what felt like a full minute. No movement, no sound, just recognition. It was subtle, just the way his head tilted slightly to the left, the same way it had in the photo, the same way Ava said he used to look at her before approaching. Tears slid down her face. "He remembers," she whispered. "I swear he does." She sat down on the grass by the fence, not speaking, not moving. Django stepped forward slowly, cautiously, then stopped a few feet away. He didn't press his head to the wire this time. He just lay down near her, his body turned slightly toward her as if he, too, needed to remember what it felt like to be seen by someone who once believed in him. The two of them stayed like that for over an hour. No roar, no drama, just stillness, shared memory, mutual peace. After she left, Ava asked if she could return. "Even just to sit," she said. "He helped me grow up. I want to help him grow back into himself." Marco nodded, his eyes glistening. So she became part of our routine. Another quiet presence in the background of Django's days. And with every visit, every calm moment, Django took another step forward. Back into the world, back into trust, back into life. It had been nearly 2 months since the flood when we finally opened the main gate to the large roaming enclosure, a space built long before Django arrived but never used for an animal like him. It spanned nearly 2 acres, lined with tall grass, shaded patches, and natural obstacles that mimicked the wild but remained secure. The kind of space meant not just for safety, but for freedom. We didn't plan anything grand. No audience, no cameras. Just Marco, Ellie, Ava, and me standing silently by the gate as the last bolt slid open. Django stood on the other side, watching. He didn't rush. Instead, he stepped forward with caution, placing one paw on the soil beyond the familiar boundary. His eyes scanned the field, wider than anything he'd had since his time in captivity. The wind lifted through his mane, stirring it gently like fingers through hair, and something about it seemed to awaken a piece of him we hadn't seen yet. He walked, first slowly, then with more confidence. His limp remained, but there was strength behind his stride now. We watched as he explored the far side of the enclosure, sniffing a half-fallen tree, brushing against a low-hanging branch. He stopped to drink from the pond in the center, then stood there a while, still and statuesque. And then he ran. Not for long, not fast, but enough. Enough to remind us all that a lion, no matter how broken, still remembers what it means to move with power. Ava cried quietly beside me. "I forgot how big he really is," she said, barely above a whisper. "He just seemed smaller when he was hurting." Marco didn't say anything. He just watched, his jaw tight, hands clenched loosely behind his back. I think we were all a little scared. Not of Django leaving, but of how deeply we'd all grown attached to him. He was no longer just a rescued lion. He was ours. Not in ownership. In connection. By late afternoon, Django had found a quiet patch of tall grass near the edge of the field and settled in. He didn't return to the smaller enclosure that evening, even when Ellie brought food. We left it near the gate. He'd come if he needed. That was the new rule now. We'd earned his trust, but we also had to respect his space. That night, I stayed at the shelter. I couldn't leave. Not yet. I lay on a cot just outside the main fence, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the soft sounds of crickets and the distant shuffle of Django's paws in the grass. It was the most peaceful silence I'd heard in months. He was no longer just surviving. He was home. And we were all better for it. A month after Django took his first steps into the open enclosure, everything had changed. Not just for him, but for all of us. The shelter felt different now. Not louder, not busier, just braver. As if Django's journey had somehow stitched courage into the fences, the trees, and the people who walked between them. Other animals responded too. The wolf dog who once refused to eat in daylight now wagged his tail when Marco passed. The injured owl began perching closer to human presence, blinking with cautious curiosity. And Django, he had claimed the far hill as his throne. Every morning, just after sunrise, we'd find him stretched out along the ridge, framed by the golden sky, eyes half closed, mane moving gently with the breeze. Sometimes he'd watch the other animals. Sometimes he'd sleep. Sometimes, rare and quiet, he'd let out a single low roar that rippled through the air like a prayer. Not loud, not angry, just there. A sound that said, "I'm still here." One afternoon, as Ava sat sketching him from the lower yard, Django rose and walked, slowly but confidently, down the slope. He didn't stop at the pond. He didn't pause in the grass. He walked all the way to the fence, looked at her, and then he lay down, just like he used to, just like that photo from long ago. She didn't speak. She didn't move closer. She just let the moment settle between them like dust in warm light. That quiet connection, untouched by words or need, was the culmination of everything we'd worked for. Later that evening, Marco leaned against the gate beside me. "You know," he said, eyes fixed on the lion in the distance, "we saved him, but he saved us too." And it was true. In a world that often rushes past pain, Django had forced us to slow down, to see, to witness what gentleness could do when the world had already taken so much. He reminded us that healing doesn't follow a schedule. It arrives in its own time, on its own terms. One step, one look, one moment of trust at a time. And in that reminder was a quiet lesson, that even those who've roamed the edge of death can return, not just to survive, but to rule their peace with dignity. So if this story ever reaches someone lost, someone tired, someone who thinks the world has moved on without them, let Django remind you of this. Even after the flood, the gate can still open. Even after you've been forgotten, you can still be found. And even after everything, you are still worthy of rest, of freedom, of love. If this journey moved you, share it. Someone out there may need to be reminded that healing is real and that even lions get scared. But with patience, kindness, and a little space to breathe, they come home.